welcome to our first Cure HHT Board of Directors Town Hall. This is your chance to meet 6 of Cure HHT's board directors for an insider's view of what's happening at Cure HHT. We want you interacting with the panel, asking your questions, and giving your feedback and ideas. To make this event as interactive as possible, I want to show you around Zoom. There is a panel on your, at the bottom of your screen, it may be at the top of your screen, that will allow you to click over a Q&A icon. This will allow you to type in a question that I can ask on your behalf. Another way that you can ask a question tonight is if under participants, if you find your name, you can raise your hand by clicking over the More button at the bottom. It has 3 dots and a circle and says More. And if you raise your hand, I'll be able to unmute you to ask your question live. If you are chosen to ask your question live, I'll send you a request to unmute your microphone or speaker. And once you receive this request, you'll be able to speak to the board members directly. Just remember that these board members are not able to respond to specific questions about medical treatment. The other icon that will be important for tonight is your chat button. It's at the bottom of your screen as well. And this will allow you to either chat with individuals or to the whole group. We may occasionally provide a link of resources from our website or expand on a statement, and those will be in the chat box as well. For now, everybody has been muted, and this presentation is live and being recorded. And we just ask that at the end of the webinar, you will be directed to a survey, and we just ask you to take the time to give us your feedback. And that way we'll be able to better develop future webinars and town halls. So as I get started, I want to remind you, as I said, that this town hall is live and recorded, and that it's very important that you ask questions tonight that are relevant to the conversation. So let's get started. I am just so excited to introduce you to 6 of our Cure HHT board members. We currently have 4 with us. 2 will be joining us shortly. Dr. Sara Palmer, Mark Topaz, Harry Chapman, and Mary Jo McCune are on with us now, and Dr. Scott Olitsky and Jim Lapides will be joining us shortly. Our volunteer board members are passionate about helping people with HHT. Many of them have HHT or their family members have HHT, and some were volunteers for the foundation for many years before joining the board. First, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sara Palmer. She joined the Cure HHT Board of Directors in 2015. She's currently serving as our board president. Dr. Palmer is a retired clinical psychologist and author of the book Living with HHT, Understanding and Managing Your HHT. Sara initially volunteered for the foundation as a regional network alliance coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic states. She is from Baltimore, Maryland. So Sara, can you tell us a little bit about Cure HHT's mission and value statements before you share your HHT story?
Sure, thanks, and welcome everybody. I just wanted to go over the mission statement of Cure HHT, which is to, of course, find a cure for HHT, but also to help save lives and improve the well-being of individuals and families who are affected by HHT at this time. In order to achieve this mission, our goals are to fund research to find better treatments and a cure, and to educate families and physicians about HHT, to provide linkages between people who are affected by HHT, so forming networks between people, collaborating with multidisciplinary HHT treatment centers, which are all over the world at this point. We want to advocate for and support those with HHT, that means you out there in the audience, and to engage the scientific and medical community. So, was there something else, Nicole, that you wanted me to review before I talk about my story?
Yeah, I know several years ago, the board developed their Cure HHT values, if you just wanted to run through those.
Sure. So we're committed to doing our work in this way. We want to be, we always strive to be compassionate, to be ethical in what we do, primarily to be focused on patients and families, to be responsive to our community, to do work that's results oriented and get things done, and to be collaborative in working with patients, doctors, and others in the community.
Great, thank you. If you
Sure.
could then just tell us a little bit about your HHT story.
Sure. So like most people with HHT, or many people, I didn't get diagnosed for quite a long time after my first symptoms. I started having nosebleeds when I was a little girl, probably about 3 years old, and they went on throughout my childhood. And most doctors just basically told my parents, don't worry, she'll grow out of it. No big deal. And other than that, I did pretty well. But when I got to be a young adult, I started to really struggle with a great deal of fatigue. And it turned out that I was quite anemic from having nosebleeds every day. And eventually, I got diagnosed because I went to a GI doctor, a gastroenterologist, sorry. The reason I went to him was because of the anemia. My doctor wanted to see if I was bleeding anywhere else in my body. And just luckily for me, this particular doctor had happened to have read one article about HHT in the recent past. And so he recognized that I had telangiectasias in my mouth and on my tongue, and put that together with the nosebleeds and finally made a diagnosis. And by that point, I had a son who was a little boy, and he was having nosebleeds every day. So I kind of had the feeling that he probably had it too. And like a lot of people, I kind of put my head in the sand a little bit for a while, because this doctor really didn't know much about HHT, and he didn't ring any alarm bells about it. He just kind of said, well, you probably should try to deal with this at some point. But eventually I read more on my own. I got in touch with the foundation, the HHT Foundation, and I started to realize that this could be pretty serious and that I better get myself tested. So I eventually got to Yale, which was at that time, I think, either the only or one of a few HHT centers at the time. This was back in the 90s. And I finally had the diagnosis confirmed and had my kids tested and found out that one of my sons, the one with the nosebleeds, did in fact have HHT also. And I was very grateful that I had the attention of the HHT Foundation, as Cure HHT was called back then, because they really got me into the right treatment and into the right center. And I felt that I had really been able to spare my kids from going through a lot of pain potentially because of that. And so I got interested in volunteering with Cure HHT right away, and I started to do a number of things. Various kinds of fundraising campaigns. And as Nicole said, I at the time we were doing these regional network groups. I started doing that in Maryland. I got involved with the Hopkins HHT Center when it first developed here in Baltimore. Started giving some presentations, and then I just became sort of more involved with the foundation. I went to more conferences and learned a lot, and I went to a lot of the walks and volunteer things and so forth. And eventually, I had met a lot of the people on the board as a result of going to these conferences. And eventually, I did get on the board, as Nicole said, back in 2015. And along the way of doing all of these things, I also, because I had been a clinical psychologist, but with a specialty in health and rehabilitation, I decided that I would write a book about HHT for patients and families, because nothing like that existed. And I felt that there was a real need and that I could do that because I'd written books about other health subjects in the past. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. Jim, are you with us now? Okay, well, I'm not sure his audio is on, so we will move on to Harry Chapman. Harry joined the Cure HHT Board of Directors in 2014. and he serves as a member of the Board Communications and Marketing Committee. Harry is a retired news anchor and University Development Director, and he and his family live in Nashville, Tennessee. Harry, how has HHT impacted your family?
Well, thank you very much. It has impacted my family significantly. I have 9 grandchildren, 7 of whom have HHT. All 3 of my children have HHT. You know, it's funny. I was first diagnosed in the mid-1960s. I was flight surgeons. I was going through a physical, and they said, "You've got a spot on your lung. We're going to flag you." I mean, I had nosebleeds like Sarah was talking about, off and on all my life, but never thought anything about it. I went to a doctor at Emory University who looked at my fingernails because there was clubbing. I don't know if you've heard about that, but there was clubbing on my fingernails, had nosebleeds, and he noticed the telangiectasias on my face. And he said, "You've got Osler-Weber syndrome." And I thought, okay, what's that? And he said, "Well, you've got a spot in your lung. We're going to take the middle lobe of your right lung out, and you'll be on your way." So I had major surgery. That's how they treated it in the 60s. I mean, they took out the lobe, one of the lobes of my lung. And after that, I thought I was the only person in the world who had HHT or Osler-Weber syndrome. I didn't know anything about Cure HHT. We didn't even exist at that time. Fast forward about 40 years, and my granddaughter had a brain bleed and was rushed to a hospital in Florida and had to have major surgery and was diagnosed with HHT. And then about 4 weeks later, her aunt, my daughter, was pregnant with her 3rd child and had a major bleed in her lungs. And fortunately, they got her to a hospital, and a couple of doctors, that a friend of ours who's a doctor, called them cowboy docs, said they could embolize that and take care of her. Fortunately, she survived, and my grandson was born. But it was at that point that we all realized we needed to do something. And fortunately, Jim Gossage at Augusta, Georgia, at the Cure HHT Center of Excellence, was the man. We all went there, and that's when we found out who had HHT, who did not. And then in the process, over the past several years, I've had several embolizations in my lungs, so has my daughter and one of my sons. So we're very much impacted by HHT. We go to Gossage, and that's Jim Gossage is how I got involved with the board of Cure HHT. Jim recommended me, and I'm so thankful he did. And it's been a blessing to find out about, you know, the research that's going on with HHT and the medical advances, and find, treat, and cure. Man, the Chapman family lives it. Find, treat, and cure. That's our life. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. And so, Jim, you've joined us now. He joined the board of directors in 2015 and currently serves as the co-chair for the board's development committee. Jim is the owner of the International Poster Gallery in Boston, Massachusetts. And so, Jim, would you mind sharing your HHT story?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I guess I knew about HHT my entire life. My mom had it, her father had it, and ultimately it led to certainly complications in their passing. And I had always had nosebleeds, but nothing too serious until I hit about 50. And at that point, things started to get increasingly challenging to the point where I couldn't stop bleeds at a point. And it was really a moment where all kinds of spontaneity died in my life. And it was very difficult for my wife. It meant that whether it be a dinner with friends or just sneezing or pretty much anything could have been interrupted by a bleed. And so I kind of went on a journey. I got down to a patient conference. I found out about a new procedure. I've been having lasers done for many years. It turned out the sclerotherapy was something that really worked for me and kind of changed my life. And over the next 5 years or so, I kind of figured out the right number of things, the right combination of things that would really help me control the bleeds and know how to control things and when I was going to be in trouble. And a lot of that happened because of Cure HHT. I was always in touch with Mary Ann, and the patient conference was an invaluable experience. And so it really took a good 10 years to kind of get to the point I'm at now where I really have a different life, and I'm able to work every day, and I'm able to enjoy dinners, even spicy foods. I know when I have to be a little careful. I can exercise without worrying about bleeding, etc. So this organization has literally meant the world to me. And obviously, I don't have kids, but I have nieces, nephews, I have siblings. And I've really felt that this is something that I want to make a difference with in my life. And I think that, you know, being on the board for, I don't know, the last 5 years or so, that I've been able to be part of something that is incredibly exciting. This is a working board. This is a bunch of very committed people, a small group of really thoughtful, smart, caring people from all different disciplines, from all parts of the country. And it's humbling to come to the meetings. It's astounding every quarter. You feel like your head is spinning around when you go to the board meetings and find out about all the new developments. And we're at a time now where after 26, 27 years of experience, there's a foundation that's been built by Cure HHT. It really is the cornerstone of the HHT community. We have 26 centers in the United States, Canada. There's real leverage that comes from those centers, the ability to get research done, to come up with standards and guidelines that really make sense. So it's an incredible time. We've had the Rare Disease Act, which allows all of us to enjoy much more interest from the scientific community. And so there are a lot of ideas that are running by us all the time. It's just an extraordinary opportunity to really help people live with the disease and hopefully to cure it. And I hope in my lifetime we'll be doing that.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Jim. So the next board member I'd like to introduce is Mary Jo McCune. She joined Cure HHT Board of Directors in 2018, and she currently serves on the Board Marketing Communications Committee. Mary Jo is a retired corporate executive for May Department Stores, and she initially volunteered for the foundation as a Regional Network Alliance Coordinator as well. Mary Jo lives in my rival state of and city of Columbus, Ohio.
Okay, Nicole, we won't get into that. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, like she said, I live here in Columbus, Ohio. I do snowbird down to Naples, Florida for a few months every winter, so don't hold that against me. But, you know, it's interesting when you listen to everybody's stories. It's interesting the common denominators that somewhere we all have. I listen to Sarah and I listen to Jim and Harry and some similarities. But like Sarah, I started bleeding at a very, very young age, like 4 or 5 years old, nose hemorrhages. And, you know, it was one of those things, I guess, like everybody else. Well, you know what? She bleeds like her grandfather and she bleeds like her mother, but mine were much, much worse. I was requiring blood transfusions at a very early age. And of course, at the time we were living in West Virginia, and, you know, nobody believed my mother and father when they said she had this horrible nosebleed. And it took a really freaky thing when I just went to see a doctor one day, had my blood work done, came home that night, had a horrible bleed, went back to the doctor, and they looked at my blood count and said, oh my gosh, you're right. She is. Something's wrong here. So I can remember actually being 7, 8 years old at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in the school, in the doctor's school, sitting there with my tongue out, and these physicians looking at my tongue to try to figure out what all of those little red spots were. And all of these doctors were looking and trying to figure, and it's just a memory that is always stuck in my head. I was 7 years old, sitting there with my tongue out for a bunch of physicians to look at. But you know, it was funny, when I was probably, I think 12 years old, a family friend had told us about a doctor in Columbus, Ohio, and we weren't here at the time, named Dr. Saunders. He was pioneering this procedure where they did a septal dermoplasty on children and adults who were having nosebleeds. And now I'm going to show my age, but this was like back in 1968. I was 12 years old, and I came to Columbus to see him at the Columbus Children's Hospital, and he did that septal dermoplasty on me, and it changed my life. And I really had very, very little problems. A few occasional nosebleeds after that, but nothing that was anything like I suffered as a child. It wasn't until 1990, I had been married just a couple years. I had 2 very small children. I woke up one day with just a horrible, horrible headache. And I knew it wasn't a normal headache because I don't get headaches. I was diagnosed with a brain abscess, and no one in the world could figure out how I got this brain abscess, and went through question after question after question. Where were you? What have you come into contact with? Where have you been? And it was so frustrating until somebody said, have you had any dental work done lately? And I said, yeah, I had my teeth cleaned on Friday. Bingo. And they put me on the proper antibiotics. I was very, very fortunate that I never had to have any type of surgery. They treated it with antibiotics, 6 weeks in the hospital, but it did the trick. And I had a great infectious disease specialist in Charleston, West Virginia, Dr. Michael Keegan. I will never forget him. He did the research for me, and he came into my office. He came into my office. He came into my hospital room one day and said, you know, you have these things in your lungs, and they're associated with these things in your head. And I know that sounds crazy, but I'm going to hook you up with this doctor that can explain it all. And that's where my journey began. And I met Dr. White at Yale University shortly after that, had embolizations done. My mother had embolizations done. And I have been pretty good ever since. I mean, I'm very fortunate. My family, I have 2 children. They both have HHT. I have 2 grandchildren. They both have HHT. So the odds were not in our favor, but we have mild symptoms. And we hope to keep it that way. But like we've all learned, something mild can turn into something major if you're not aware. And I think that's why our mission to make awareness a priority is the best single priority we can have. So that's kind of my story. And I'm here to tell you that I survived it all, and so will all of we.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. Very compelling. So the next person I want to introduce is Mark Topaz. He joined the Cure HHT Board of Directors in 2018 as well, and he currently serves as our board treasurer. Mark is a litigation attorney and also serves on a board for the Public Interest Law Center. He lives with his family in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia. So Mark, how has HHT impacted your family and your life?
Okay, well, first I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to interact with other people with HHT and the community that we work hard to serve. So my introduction was through my father and his 2 sisters. So they all had HHT. So I guess they were a statistical anomaly in a bad way. So I really saw the effects that it had on that generation. My father had very bad nosebleeds, sometimes couldn't get them stopped, had to go to the hospital. He had a lot of cauterizations. He had a procedure where he had a skin graft, and they tried to graft skin into his nose. My aunt had a stroke in her early 60s. So, I really saw that generation suffer. But the good thing was that I knew from basically the time that I was born that I had HHT. So I've really been aware of it my whole life. And the most important thing is that enabled me to, go to an HHT doctor. And one of the common things that I'm sure most of you have heard or are aware of is the PAVMs or the malformations that you can have in a lot of people have them in their lungs. And there's a very simple procedure for getting those embolized. It's just very easy, but if you don't know about it and don't do it, that's where you get an increased risk for a stroke. And I kind of feel very lucky that I knew about it from an early age. And I've had, I go for regular checkups. It's like once every 5 years because they grow very slowly. And, I've found 2 of them, had them taken care of, and, and so I think that's where, awareness is so important for people. And I joined the board, really a big motivator was that I passed HHT to my daughter, and I joined the board 2 years ago, really hoping to learn a lot more about HHT, both for myself, as you get older, a lot of times symptoms get worse, and that has certainly happened for me. And also so that I can pass on knowledge to my daughter.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Mark. And our final panelist tonight is Scott Olitsky. He joined the Cure HHT Board of Directors in 2017, and he currently serves on the Board Physician Education Committee. Scott retired from his medical practice as a pediatric ophthalmologist in 2018 when he became Cure HHT's Chief Medical Officer. And Scott has initiated some of Cure HHT's first awareness activities by climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and volunteering to be one of the first patients to use Avastin for nosebleeds. Scott and his family consider Kansas City, Kansas home, but he does travel around a lot, so you'll find him in lots of different locations throughout the world. Scott, can you tell us about your HHT journey?
Yes, thank you, Nicole, and welcome to everybody. My story is a little bit like Mark's. I knew I had HHT very early on. I began having nosebleeds as 4 or 5-year-old, and I remember having a cauterization probably as a 6 or 7-year-old. But it was known in my family now back 5 generations. My great-grandfather had horrible nosebleeds, and my father tells the story that when he got his license to drive as a 16-year-old, it was his job to take his grandfather, my great-grandfather, to get his fill-up transfused every week. So the disease has been well known in my family for many years. My grandfather had very bad nosebleeds. He was a dentist and used to work seeing patients with epinephrine cotton balls in his nose, which obviously wasn't very good for his heart at the time. So I've known about it for a long time. It really wasn't much of an issue for me. I remember coming across some of the other manifestations when I was in pathology in medical school. I think as a medical student, I may have seen one other patient with it. So kind of fast forward to 2000s, we had I have 3 girls. My family, my children have HHT, and my wife and I wanted to get more involved, and we got involved in the board. I think my first stint on the board was in 2009, so I've been involved with the board since then. And then I think the next big challenge for my family was when my father got very ill around 2010, 2011. And was doing very poorly with nosebleeds that could not get treated satisfactorily. And as an ophthalmologist, as Nicole mentioned, I knew about Avastin, and we were able to reach out to really a pioneer in the field who was willing to look at other options for patients. And his treatment of my father really altered his life. And as some people know, we were able to climb Kilimanjaro in 2012 together. So yeah, I think that just goes to show the power of the medical advances we have and what we can do to improve the quality of life of other people. And then I retired 2 years ago as a pediatric ophthalmologist and wanted to get more involved with Cure HHT. It's a really exciting time. I think there's a lot of potential therapeutics that are out there, and I think we're going to make a huge difference in the lives of many, many people and their families. So I turn my attention there and enjoy working with the board and a group of very dedicated staff and board members at Cure HHT.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, and for everyone joining us tonight. So we're going to move on to some questions from the audience. So again, just as a reminder, if you want me to ask a question, you can put it in the Q&A box, and I can ask that for you. Or if you go to the hover over the participants icon and click on your name down at the bottom of your screen, it would have a more button where you can raise your hand, and I can unmute you to ask the question live. So let's get started. Our first question that we have, Mary Jo, how did you become involved in the Cure HHT Board of Directors?
Well, unlike a lot of my colleagues on the board, I don't have a medical or scientific or even healthcare background. As Nicole said, I'm a retired retailer, came from the corporate retail world, but I have 60 years of experience with this disease, starting, like I said, from a very, very early age. Not only was I a granddaughter and a daughter, then I became a patient, then I became a mother, then I became a grandmother. All of these people having HHT around me, and I see how it affected our lives. I had my brain abscess in 1990, and I attended what I believe is the very first HHT conference that was here in Columbus, Ohio in 1992. I think there were like 35 people there, but we all came together. It was so exciting because I didn't think anybody in the world had this but us. But it was interesting to meet people. So I stayed involved with the foundation, with the HHT Foundation was at the time, and then Cure HHT Foundation. I was an RNA, and I attended a lot of conferences. I always tried to help out. I worked, I got involved in some of the fundraising things that happened at the conferences. And I was very, like as a mother, I think when you watch your kids go through this, it's one thing. And we were fortunate that we had mild symptoms, but I'll never forget the day my granddaughter was born. And I went into the room to see her, and I looked down at her, and the first thing I saw was a very large telangiectasia on the outside of her nose. And I knew, and my heart sunk. And not because, there's certainly much more horrible diseases you could have than this, because it can be treated, but it kind of like was an eye opener for me. And I thought, you know what, I've been around it a long time. I think I know enough about it. It's time to get involved. And I was so honored to ask to be on the board. And it was just, one of those things when I was approached and said, would you care to sit on this board? I don't bring a lot of medical experience. I just bring human experience. But that's kind of how I ended up on the board of directors. And I'm so happy that I have, because you would be amazed at the amount that is accomplished by such a small organization. It's mind-boggling, and I'm very proud and I'm very humbled to be on the board of directors. So,
well, thank you so much. We're glad to have you on the team. You bring a lot to the plate. Not everybody needs to be a doctor or scientist to move the needle forward for HHT, that's for sure. So, Harry, you had mentioned that Dr. Gossage had recommended you to become an HHT board member. What really swayed you to do that after his recommendation?
I think the impact that my family has by HHT, fortunately, my HHT is very mild, and it looks like, other than what my daughter went through and my granddaughter went through, we're all pretty mild. But when you see the impact of HHT on your family, you want to do all you can to try to find a cure for that, so they can be treatable. So the next generation doesn't have to face what we faced. You know, HHT doesn't skip a generation, but I don't know if my mother or my father had HHT, unlike some of the other folks on the board. I mean, we never knew it. The only clue I had was a great-grandfather who they said died because he had some surgery and he bled to death. And that's my only clue that somebody in my family had HHT. Again, so I wanted to do all that I could to take care of my children, and especially my grandchildren. Mary Jo, I can relate to looking at my grandchildren when they were born and thinking, oh my gosh, do you have it? I mean, my 3 children had been tested at Vanderbilt by some pretty good doctors, and they said, no, they don't have it. They don't have HHT. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, why do they have the nosebleeds? You know, what's going on here? So I wanted to do, Nicole, all I could to help do that. And I've learned a lot personally. Like I say, I didn't even know Cure HHT existed until about 6 years ago as an organization, until we had these catastrophic events happening in my family. And then it's just, I'm amazed by people like Scott and Gossage and others who have so much knowledge, and Mark, who have this, and Sarah, thank you for your great book. And Jim, I can't overlook you, who I think I'm a huge fan of Jim Levy. He likes bluegrass music. What can I say? My Boston bluegrass man. But I, you know, I have to say that you want to be involved with something like that. I cannot think of anything more worthy for me to be involved with than Cure HHT.
Well, thank you. We're glad to have you on board for sure. So Jim, the next question is for you. And the question is, what do you do as a board member?
Well, I guess I wear a few hats. I'm the co-chair of development with Dennis Routledge, and we're in charge of basically supplying the organization with really the ability to carry on its work, which is donations of all different types. And we coordinate with Marianne and everybody else around the organization to put together programs of how to raise money, and to essentially, when I say raise money, I mean, the job really is to, it's really to enable people who have Cure HHT to contribute in a way that they want to, that expresses their wishes. And actually, that's a very exciting thing. I don't think about it as raising money. I think about it as talking to people who want to make something happen in their lives and for others. And the track record is, you know, it speaks for itself. I think we've, for example, our Young Investigator program, we've funded about $1.4 million worth of Young Investigator awards, over 30 awards. And they have generated about $34 million in foundation grants for many of these young researchers over the course of time. Everybody from the Department of Defense, the CDC, all different organizations that find our work really compelling and important. You know, this is a vascular disease, and it's about bleeding. You know, you might say, well, why is the Department of Defense interested in this? And we're doing research that helps to understand the mechanism of bleeding. That's pretty important. And so it involves more than just HHT. So that's a very exciting thing. And there are a lot of people who have this disease who want to make a difference. And of course, you know, people give in all different kinds of ways. A lot of people donate their time. A lot of people donate their treasure. And the idea is to make it a really meaningful, powerful experience for people, and to connect with people and find out what their problems are and to understand their problems is something that I'm really proud to do. The other thing I'm involved in is the executive board, and that's a small group of people on the board who help sort of steer the direction of the organization. And we have supplemental meetings on a monthly basis to then kind of put the program together for the rest of the board in quarterly meetings. And there are a lot of decisions that have to be made about, you know, which drugs we want to pursue, what centers, how do we want the centers to move. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. And, you know, one of the things that's really exciting too is that in all these jobs, we're all coordinating with each other. I'm not on the nominating committee, but in my work, I meet a ton of people and a lot of people who want to be on the board. And so that's something that I then coordinate with the folks like Mark on the nominating committee. So at any rate, that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. And speaking of that, Mark, do you want to talk about what you do through the nominating committee?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm actually not on the nominating committee.
Oh.
I'm a treasurer and the fundraising committee. The development committee is what I work on with Jim.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we have a question coming in from the audience asking Sara, as the newest board president, what is your vision for your tenure? What are your goals?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think that my goals really are to help steer the board and the organization in terms of, you know, planning for our strategy, planning for what our priorities are going to be over the next several years. And we've done a lot of work on that already as a board. And we're always trying to hone that, responding to, you know, what's happening in the research world and what the needs of the community are. I also am very interested in awareness and in community engagement. And one of my goals is to have the entire board be more involved with events like this, where we can communicate with you, the community, and you can know us a little better, and we can have a better dialogue so that we know more about the community that we're serving and you know more about us. So those are my main priorities, I would say.
Okay. Well, speaking of that and wanting to know how people engage with us, I'm going to launch a quick poll, which basically is asking people, how do they follow Cure HHT? If you could just take a couple of seconds and choose an answer. Great. So I'm sharing the results with everyone, and you can see that we have a large percentage of people that do follow us on Facebook. But our largest group is, you know, going to the HHT website, which is the #1 source of information and materials. So that's good to see. All right, our next question that's coming from the audience, and I'll open this up to whoever would like to answer. What is the status of any research activities to find a cure and new treatment therapies? Scott, do you want to try taking that?
Sure, I'll try. So we have a number of projects in the pipeline, and some of them are very exciting. Some of them involve medications like Avastin, which probably a number of people have heard about and some are using, and how to predict who it's going to work on best and why it may not work on other people. I'm sure hopefully people have heard a little bit about the proposed pazopanib study, which is, potentially a very exciting medication, which may work as well or potentially better than Avastin, but is in pill form. So those are a couple of the research things that are really coming up we're on now. There's other medications that we're looking to repurpose that are used for other things that may be useful for HHT. But in the background to all of this are basic science people that, as I think Jim mentioned, the pilot funding, these small projects to get people seed money from the government, whether it be the NIH or the Department of Defense. And these turn into, a relatively small grant can turn into a much, much larger grant that really will eventually help everybody or many people in our community. And also working with our patient registry, which hopefully people have seen that we've engaged the Backpack Health app that will allow not only patients to have something useful that they can carry their information with them, but also that we can listen to them to find out what's important to them so we can help direct some of that research. It's ongoing and upcoming.
Great, thank you. So Mark, would you like to tell us what you do as a board member then, since as a treasurer and working with Jim in the budgets?
Yeah, so I'm the treasurer and I work on the financial statements. We meet once a month. We go over our revenue, our expenses, our the investments that we have, just and especially it's been with the coronavirus and COVID, it's been a tough time for all charities. So we're just trying to go through, make sure our finances are in order. Our committee has a call once a month. Right now we're working on the budget for the next year. We're on a June 30th year, so we're spending a lot of time going through the budget right now. And we also prepare financial analysis for the board meetings. We have probably about three or four board meetings every year. So we work on that also. On the development committee, and Jim really does a fantastic job on that committee and is much more involved than I am. But we reach out to potential donors and people in the community, answer questions that they may have. So just interacting and thanking people for the contributions, because it's so much of our fundraising really does come at a grassroots level from just, through Facebook, or just people having, Facebook fundraisers that, those, and a lot of it is just smaller contributions that really add up, and it's important to the functioning of our organization. I mean, we raise so much money through just the grassroots efforts, from community members.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I want to ask, what's been the most surprising or interesting thing, Mark, that you have found or learned by being a board member with Cure HHT?
Two things come to mind, and I'm one of the people on the board that has no medical background at all. So one thing that was really interesting to me, and this was actually a webinar that Nicole is running this webinar, but Nicole runs a lot of different interesting webinars. And there was a webinar with a geneticist and also a patient that had some really severe symptoms, and didn't want to, wanted to make sure she didn't pass it on to the next generation. So she worked with a geneticist to, basically during her pregnancy, make it so that to be sure that she would not pass on HHT. And that was just a very, very interesting webinar. And, it's something, I have a daughter who's 21 years old. And, ultimately to me, that's going to be her decision as to what she wants to do. But I never really knew that that was an option. And that is something that, you know, can eliminate it. Once you eliminate it from the last person in a generation, it's really eliminated from your, you know, your whole line in the future. But there's also, you know, there are also ethical issues, and you know, it was just a very informative webinar from both the perspective of the geneticist and the perspective of the patient. It was like a very emotional webinar. It's probably on our website. So that was one thing. And the other thing that I find really interesting is during our board meetings, we talk about some of the research that we're doing, and pazopanib. We have a board member, his name is Dennis Sprecher, and he's very familiar with the FDA process. And this pazopanib drug is one that seems to hold a lot of promise for people with pretty severe symptoms where other things aren't working. And Avastin has worked well for a lot of people, but it seems to work for a certain period of time and then sometimes doesn't work. I mean, every patient has a different experience with it, but at least in some people, and the thought is that maybe this pazopanib may be something that's longer lasting. So I find those portions of the board meeting where Dennis really kind of goes in to the FDA process and everything we're trying to do to kind of help promote the study to be very interesting.
Great, thank you. And we're actually getting ready to file some more things with the FDA tomorrow. So we are definitely advancing that project forward. We have a question here from the audience asking any one of the board members, what do you see as the biggest challenge facing the organization right now? Don't all jump in at once.
Education.
Okay, Harry.
I just think education. I mean, you still run into doctors who are not educated as to what HHT is. It was maybe some cases a small paragraph in a medical book, and trying to educate medical personnel. In my case, about what HHT is. So I think HHT. I mean, education, not only physicians but population as well.
Well, I have a poll to launch here, and then we'll have some more feedback on that, asking what do you consider to be the most important Cure HHT project? So if everyone on the event tonight can take a moment and fill that in, and we'll share the results. Well, that was pretty quick. I'm just wondering, Mary Jo, were you going to mention something?
Yeah, I was, and I forget. No, I think I was thinking about awareness. I mean, it's so incredibly critical because, as he mentioned, even our physicians that we're seeing on a daily basis are not aware. So, I mean, it's not only a challenge to bring it to the general public, it's a challenge to bring it to the physicians that treat all of us, and that we see all the time. Some of them don't want, you know, I think we've all had the experience of a doctor that just doesn't want to be told anything that he might not know. So that really is a critical thing. I can remember back in 1990 when I had this brain abscess. I'm being wheeled into this room to have my lungs embolized, and actually Dr. White was doing it via phone with a radiologist in Pittsburgh. I mean, it was kind of crazy, but anyhow, these I don't know if the interns or whatever were really rolling me in there and said, "You have HHT." That was like a trick question on our medical exams. And I know and I don't know that that's really changed a lot. I mean, so I think, you know, I think awareness and obviously funding. I mean, we can't stress enough how critical our fundraising goals are, and our need to have, you know, grassroots campaign out there getting money, and raising the funds that we need, because we just, you know, we're not a big major corporation. We're just, you know, Mary Ann's basement is, you know, it's our office, it's our corporate office. So that's another huge challenge I see for the board, and it's, you know, something that we all need to think about.
I did want to
Yeah, I think
respond to the poll and just say that it seems like most people are saying they're interested in research and clinical trials, and that is a huge priority for us. We just got a grant from the CZI, which is the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, to develop patient-led research networks, and we'll be doing more with that in the future. I think, you know, the idea of finding a cure, finding better treatments for HHT is always a priority, and that we are working very hard on supporting scientists through our Young Investigator Awards, and, you know, as someone said, getting the grant for the pazopanib trial and doing other things along those lines. And I think that is very important. And that is what the Cure HHT is really committed to. And I think the board members support that effort in terms of doing all these other things, like trying to raise awareness, trying to get people involved, trying to raise money and organize priorities for these research trials and so forth. But I don't want people to think that that's not something we're doing, because that certainly is a priority. But also it is Awareness Day, so I wanted to emphasize that again too, and I think that's right, that we need to continue to bring awareness to both the public and to physicians. Even though we have so many HHT centers of excellence now in this country and around the world, we still have many, many doctors in the community who don't know what HHT is. And so we do have to continue the push for education.
Scott, would you address, maybe to follow up Sarah's comments about some of the projects that are going on in the various centers and some of the different efforts that we've got, just to give people a sense of how extensive all the research efforts are?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned there are some, excuse me, some new studies looking at predicting the efficacy of Avastin for individual patients, looking at best dosages. Mark had mentioned the pazopanib, which is, you know, a very exciting possibility for us. Pomalidomide, or Pomalyst, is now funded at several studies looking at the use of, again, repurposing a drug that was designed for multiple myeloma, but is being used successfully in some patients with HHT. You know, that's on one spectrum, a relatively uncommon drug that tends to be very expensive. And on the other spectrum, we're looking at the use of doxycycline, which is, you know, a very old drug, really by today's standards, incredibly cheap, and seems to be helping people. But, you know, we need to know how well these work. Patient anecdotal stories are important. That's what starts research. But really performing these studies where we have centers coming together and pooling data is really where we're going to make a difference. And, you know, it starts with that, right? I mean, a couple patients get Avastin, they do well. But in order to allow our patients to access insurance payments for these very expensive treatments, we need to perform, you know, scientific research that will prove to insurers and the FDA that these medications work and are safe for patients with HHT.
And there's a really exciting link there between research and then where the rubber meets the road in the centers. I think that's one of the most exciting areas, that a lot of these breakthroughs have to be transferred to our centers in a way that's standardized. And we just had one of our donors fund the standards and guidelines effort that hadn't been done in 11 years. And we have a whole new set of standards and guidelines that address many, many areas that weren't even addressed 10 or 11 years ago, that will become used by doctors all over the world. And that's very important to us. And on top of that, we have a very strong program of supporting our centers to make sure that there is certification and that there's recertification procedures so that all the centers should be up to date on all the practices. And that means a lot to everyone because it's very hard. You know, doctors have preferences and whatnot, but they have to know what the standards are. And I should let you talk, Scott. That's your area.
Yeah, I think you can't overstate that, especially the need to update the guidelines. Any physician who wants to look at the standard of treatment for patients with HHT will be able to go online, pick up a journal, go online and see what those standards are. So for many patients who I think have had the frustration of knowing themselves what they hear on the webinar or what they see on the website, or they hear from their physician, and they get pushback sometimes from other physicians that, you know, this is not something that they typically do. We're going to have that in a peer-reviewed journal that is reviewed and has been vetted through, you know, dozens of HHT specialists from around the world. So again, I don't think you can overstate the importance of what those guidelines will do for patients.
Yeah, and I think one thing that from my own personal experience, I grew up in New Haven. Of course, Dr. White was in New Haven. But, you know, I live in Boston now, and I have nieces and nephews around the country. I travel, my family travels. We all need a center network. We can all rely on one center, and I think that connection between a doctor and a patient, a real ombudsman for each patient, is so important. It's kind of transformed a lot of my care, and I think everybody else who has that relationship understands how important that is. But it's also really critical for us to have a center that's robust and really working as a team together. And I think, Scott, you've brought an enormous amount of dialogue and communication that is something really helpful to us now. So there's a lot more linkage between this world of research and this world of everyday practice and treatment, and then of course to awareness, because the centers are really important to bringing awareness all over the country, et cetera. So it's a model that is, I think, very powerful and is only going to get better.
Well, fantastic. This has been a great dialogue, and I think you guys have tied this up in a really pretty bow because, as we mentioned, today is Global HHT Awareness Day, and the theme for us for this year is education. We know that that's a critical component, and I do think that the clinical guidelines will raise awareness in the medical communities, which I know you all have addressed, because it will be in these large specialty publications. We're working right now on getting endorsements from all different types of specialty groups, which will just, you know, spread the awareness throughout their professional societies. And, you know, so this is all tied together. Not only is it raising awareness and education to the medical community, it's going to help the patient community get better treatment. It'll help our centers around the world have more standardized care. And it will also play into a catalyst for research programs going forward. So just on behalf of everyone at Cure HHT, I want to thank everyone for attending tonight's town hall. I hope you enjoyed learning about our board members and their personal experiences with HHT, how they got involved with the board, what they're working on, and how they're contributing to HHT awareness, research, and education. Our board members would love to talk with you directly about how you can become involved in the board. And if you do get involved in the organization, you will make things happen. That much we can promise. So at the end of this broadcast, you will receive a link. You'll be directed to a short survey. Please take a few minutes to provide us that feedback. And there is a space to include your contact information if you would like a board member to contact you directly. Just as a reminder, Cure HHT is the only patient advocacy organization in the world for HHT. And we see our mission from Sara, that we are here from you, the entire HHT community of patients, families, healthcare providers, and researchers, and that you can rely on us for answer your questions, provide timely updates, and any other support you need through COVID-19 and beyond. So we just hope that you remember that there are recorded webinars that can be found on our website under the resources and webinars. And that any donation, if you would like to support us, you will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and links to our donation page. Any amount of contribution is very much appreciated. So again, I want to thank all of our board members for volunteering their time all year long, but I especially want to thank tonight Sarah, Scott, Mark, Harry, Jim, and Mary Jo. We truly appreciate your participation, and I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Good night.
Thanks, Nicole.
Right.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.